Hi guys, in this video we're going to discuss the topic of the beginning playing level and how to win at the beginning play level. So what we're really going into is more or less a discussion of, okay, what is the beginning level of play? What is it characterised by? What things do you expect to see and to have happen if you're a beginner and your opponent is a beginner? So what are the characteristics of that level of play? And then once we've talked a little bit about that, I'll give you some ideas as a beginner or relative new player, how you can give yourself the best chance of winning at that level against another roughly equal beginning opponent using long pips or anti-spin. And again, we're just going to make this fairly general. I'm not going to try and get into super detailed match tactics at this level. It's just really a sweeping overview, if you like, to give you the big picture of what playing as beginner and winning as beginner against other table tennis beginners is all about. So to start with, for beginners, what would be, if I had to put it into one word, what beginning level of play is all about? What word would I use? Well, the word I'd probably use is mistakes. It's all about, at the beginning level of play, it's all really about mistakes and how many mistakes are made, both by you and by your opponent. Probably two words would be better to describe it, and the two-word description I would use that really encapsulates beginning level of play would be unforced mistakes, unforced errors. And that, in a nutshell, is what I think beginning level of play is more or less just about all about when you really get down to it. And later on I'll be discussing the intermediate level of play and the advanced level of play. And it's not necessarily a total distinction between beginning, between intermediate and between advanced. It's sort of like a line along which you go rather than this. But definitely when you're comparing the beginning level of play to the intermediate level of play, the first thing that is really immediately obvious is the amount of unforced errors and just errors in general that are made at the beginning level. And that's a real defining characteristic of beginning table tennis, is just errors and unforced errors. What are some other characteristics of beginning level play that will tell you that you're sort of at that beginner level, or your opponents as well are at that beginner level? The sort of thing that you'll see is, if you're looking at the play, you'll see that most points are really won on your opponent's mistake rather than your own good shots. And vice versa, your opponent will win a lot of his points from your mistakes rather than a lot from his good shots. So errors are the watchword. And other things in relation to that is usually stuff like, at the beginning level of play, being able to read the spin is suspect. Beginners don't do a very good job of actually recognising what spin is on the ball, just what type of spin often, and secondly, the amount of spin. So they're not very good at actually picking up the spin on the ball, either the type or amount. Even if they do pick up the type or the spin on the ball, they're very often very bad at actually knowing what to do, how to handle that spin. So at the beginning level, they may see it's a backspin ball, but they will still struggle to find the right bat angle to adjust for that amount of backspin. So even if they do know it's heavy backspin, they quite often won't be able to naturally get the bat angle correct. That also leads into other things at beginning level of play. They may see it's a heavy backspin ball, but they won't play the right stroke. Or they may see it's a topspin ball and will be playing the wrong stroke with the wrong bat angle. And again, those are another characteristic. It's just not only is it hard for them to pick up what spin, it's hard for them to actually deal with the spin. And in that case, I'm really just talking about basic backspin, float, or topspin. They struggle with that. And if you're a beginner, you'll probably find you're struggling just with handling that, let alone starting to talk about the addition of side spin. And in the beginning game, I mean, one of the most obvious signs that someone is a beginner is that when you add side spin into the mix, when you give them backspin and side spin, they don't know what to do with the side spin. They don't allow for the side spin, and the ball will start jumping off at very odd angles because they haven't dealt with it at all. That's where at the intermediate level, when you start to step up and move into the intermediate level, people will start to be able to recognise and to a certain extent handle the side spin that's put on the ball. But at the beginning level, that side spin is a very confusing factor. They're already struggling with backspin and topspin. Adding side spin and adding that combination of backspin, side spin, or topspin, side spin, really tends to bamboozle them and confuse them a lot. Other characteristics of beginning level play, footwork and stance, positioning will all tend to be very suspect. The footwork will often be non-existent, or there'll be a lot of leaning around. The stance will often be very narrow, knees will be straight, they'll be reaching a lot for balls. Again, as I mentioned, the choice of strokes will often be incorrect for the type of ball they're receiving. So they haven't yet learnt as a beginner what is your best stroke for certain situations. Also, in that case, there are certain times where even they may know what stroke to play, they're just very, very poor at playing it. So even if they do know, oh, it's heavy topspin, I should block it, they're very bad at actually executing the stroke. The technique itself is inconsistent and quite often incorrect, leading to more errors. Other characteristics of beginning level play that you'll find that the service of a beginner, his service will generally be very long. Occasionally some beginners can serve and put some side spin on the ball on their serve. Others will just serve plain old backspin or topspin with no side spin at all. Quite often those who are serving with side spin, when the ball, or if the ball does come back, they don't handle that very well. They don't handle the side spin coming back to them on the third ball very well. But long serves are generally a characteristic. You don't see a lot of placed short serves in beginning level play. Same with the return of serve. At this level, they're generally concentrating just trying to get the ball back on the table. They're not looking at really placement or depth. So the return of serve is almost always a long return serve, bouncing once and going off the sideline or off the end of the table. So that's characteristic of beginners: long serves, long return of serves. Also, finishing with talking about beginners level play, with beginners there are usually what we'd call gaps in their game. There are certain holes that beginners have just because they're new to the sport. They haven't yet had time to develop an all-round game and sort out all their errors. So usually what you'll find with the beginners, there'll be certain gaps in these areas. There'll be gaps in their technique. So beginners will usually have some strokes that they play adequately. They'll sometimes play a decent backhand push or a backhand hit or a basic forehand hit. And there'll be other strokes that tend to be non-existent, such as quite often the forehand push is very poor. The backhand loop, non-existent. That kind of thing. Looping itself, well, yeah, some beginners sort of they start experimenting with the loop stroke. They're usually quite erratic with it. I tend to think of a loop stroke starting to get to more advanced level, intermediate level play really anyway. So the absence of a loop stroke I don't call, that's just the fact that beginners usually haven't got the timing and the touch to consistently brush the ball and generate a good heavy topspin. And that again comes back to their technique. They haven't spent the time on the table yet to produce consistent, decent level technique. They'll also quite often have a gap in their handling of the spin of the ball, or just different strokes. So a lot of beginners you'll find you'll often get two types of beginners. You'll get the steady beginner who's quite good at just pushing the ball, not taking a lot of risks, and just wants to play that little push with not much topspin. And his game usually go to pieces if the other player can put a heavy spin on the ball, be it backspin or topspin, and he normally can't handle the amount of spin so well, he can't adapt so well. There are other players who simply want to play everything topspin and don't push, can't push, and they have a gap again in their handling of spin. They can't handle a certain type of spin. And the third thing that you'll find is a gap in their game is usually tactically wise, or in terms of their tactics. The gap is simply that quite often there is no tactics. They have no tactics. They just get out there, they do what they can do, and they play. And they don't really think a lot about why they're doing what they're doing, or even what their opponent is doing, and what they could do better. They're just blazing away, playing their game without a lot of consideration on their opponent. And I guess you could call that a characteristic as well, is that the focus is often very much on themselves and what are they doing, what stroke are they playing, how are they playing it, and there's very little focus on the opponent. What is the opponent doing? How does the opponent play? Is the opponent good at this or bad at that? So it's very internal. It's an inward focus rather than an outward focus, and that's another characteristic of beginning level play. So really, those in a nutshell are the characteristics, are the factors that define, in my opinion, beginning level play. Those are the things that beginners tend to do. And not everybody will do it all equally. Some beginners will be a little bit better here, a little worse there. Sometimes a beginner will have a very good, almost an intermediate level shot somewhere, perhaps a forehand hit or a very steady backhand push, where the rest of their game is still very beginner level. They may have one strength. They're still a beginner, they're just having strength in one area. But with these characteristics, talking about these characteristics of beginner level play, how can we use these? How can we take advantage of these characteristics as a beginner yourself with using long pips or anti-spin on one side of your bat? How can you take advantage of beginner level play to increase your chances to win against other beginners? And that's really the focus here that I'm talking about, is as you being a beginner, a relative beginner, against other relative beginners. When you come up against a decent intermediate level player, you're going to be outmatched. And it's a lot of this stuff that I'm going to talk about in a second. It'll maybe help you a little bit, but it's not going to win you the game, because the intermediate level player has generally just done more table time, more training, he's more solid, and although you'll maximise your play and your chances, it's not really, we're not trying to say that a beginner long pip anti-player can suddenly beat an intermediate inverted rubber player. I'm not trying to give you tips on doing that. I'm trying to give you tips on how to play and beat the people of around your level as a beginner, which is what you should be focusing on really. And then as you improve, you'll move up the steps to intermediate play. Okay. So talking about reducing your mistakes, how can we take advantage of that? How can we go about doing that so that you make a lot less errors and tighten up your game? And that will usually be enough just by itself to give you the win against other beginners. We're going to talk a lot more about other stuff too, but in order to reduce your mistakes as a beginning long pip or anti-spin player, what you need to be doing is you need to be focusing on playing in such a way that you're maximising your percentages and taking full advantage of your long pips and anti-spin and making life as difficult as possible for your opponent without confusing yourself too much. Now, where I'm coming from here is I'm treating beginners basically as someone who has more or less the basic shots, can play a push, can play a basic topspin, probably doesn't have a wonderful loop on either side. You know, you're probably finding you're a bit erratic with your loop, and is struggling probably to, you know, and makes a lot of errors. So you haven't got any super strengths at this point. So what I'd be saying, what my recommendations would be is, firstly, what we've got to do is we need to you need to take a good look at your game and base your tactics around. Okay, having talked about all those characteristics of beginning level play, how can we put them into use so as to maximise your chances as a beginner with long pips or as a beginner with anti-spin, to maximise your chances of beating other beginning players? What can we do to improve your chances of winning? Well, what we want to be able to do is, using our knowledge of what beginner level players like and what your opponent is like and what you're like, we want to be able to say, okay, this is what you can do to win more often and against people around your standard. And what it really focuses on is, and what you need to be focusing on, is basically reducing your mistakes as much as possible while increasing and taking advantage of your opponent's tendency to make mistakes. So we're trying to tighten up our game and make less silly mistakes, less unforced errors. We're trying to give away a lot less cheap points, and we're trying to take advantage of the fact that our opponent will make mistakes, will make unforced errors, and give away points to us. And that's what it really needs to revolve around at the beginner level. It's not so much you hitting wonderful shots and hitting winners and hitting amazing strokes, but basically just avoiding all the silly errors that give your opponent free shots, free points. Now, in order to do that, what we're going to do is, there's several things that we need to do and get right in order to maximise your chances. The first thing we really need to do is have a good look at your game and the way that you play, and what your strengths are right now. Now, at the beginning level, there's probably, to start with, you need probably about 4 things, I'd guess. Well, not guess, but there are about 4 things I'd recommend that you really need to win at the beginner level and to start moving up into intermediate status. Okay. The first thing that you really would need is, and that I would recommend that any long pip anti-spin player should have, is you should have a solid push both sides of the table. Okay. That's probably, even if you had only that, you could probably win. I know when I started as a beginner, I wasn't using long pips or anti-spin. I was using smooth on both sides, and all I had was a backhand push, an easy forehand push, and a block. And I moved from beginner to intermediate very fast, because all I did was stand at the table, vary my spin from float to medium to very heavy, block the ball that anybody hit to me, and then go straight back to chopping and pushing the ball right up the table. And against other beginners, that's the ability to push a ball, float, medium, heavy, and on both sides steadily, and then if the opponent hits it, just to block the ball back and then go straight back into pushing. That's enough to move just about from beginner to intermediate, just there and then. But it's how I'm talking about a nice steady push there. So if you can do that, that's probably what I would say would be the foundation that you need, the basic foundation, the fundamental stroke is a decent push off both sides, so that you can play at beginner level just a steady game and cut your mistakes down, so you've always got on each side just a safe stroke that's defensive and that can control the play. The reason also why it's so important is that against other beginners, they generally have a lot of trouble hitting the ball against backspin. If they want to hit the ball and attack it, and you're putting a good heavy backspin on the ball, you're going to make them miss a lot to start with. Once they get discouraged about missing the attack so much, they'll go back to pushing usually, and then what you'll usually find is either that they won't be able to push very well and you'll outlast them, or basically they'll get frustrated and try and hit through you and just miss, and you'll go through, you'll win that way. But a basic good push is absolutely fundamental that you really do need. Secondly, at the beginning level, you'll also need, on the side that you prefer your anti-spin or you prefer your long pips, so your standard side for it, which is generally the backhand. It may not be, it may be your forehand, but let's go with the assumption that it's your backhand. On that side, you should be able to play at close up to the table a good push with the long pips or with the anti-spin. It doesn't have to be super aggressive. You don't need a lot of spin variation with it. Nothing tricky. We're not talking about anything tricky at this level. Just the ability to use consistently your long pip or your anti-spin to put the ball back on the table and make the person hit another shot. So we're just really talking about a simple level push with the long pips or the anti. So the pushing game is important at the beginning level. It's really what I would call a fundamental thing. Now, for those of you who hate pushing, that's okay. I'm not saying that you're going to be pushing for the rest of your life, but to beat other beginners, I'm talking to you as the easiest way to beat other beginners, and the easiest way to beat other beginners as a beginner yourself is to have a very fundamentally solid push game, because you'll push them off the table. They won't handle the spin variation. Okay, another thing that you'll need is on your favourite side with the inverted is you need a decent put away. And by that I mean you don't need, say, generally it's going to be your forehand, so we'll talk as in terms of your forehand. I'm not saying that you need the ability on that forehand to hit 3 loops in a row or 3 attacks in a row, or when someone's pushing to you to open the attack and then hit the next one. I'm not even going that far. All I'm saying is that on your inverted side, say your forehand, is you need the ability that when that ball pops up nice and high, you can hit it away and just bang it and put it away. Or on the backhand side, whatever. So I'm not talking about hitting lots of them in a row. I'm not talking about being able to open up off a push, get the ball up, hit the next one. All I'm really talking about is the ability that if your opponent puts the ball that high off the table on your good side, where you're ready for it, you can just basically go hit and hit a good strong attack. That's the third thing that you need, or you should have, or at least be working towards. Those are the things that you kind of should be working towards. So just a good, strong, one-shot attack. Okay. A fourth thing that you may or may not need at this level. I would recommend working on this at this level straight away. Others would say work on it a bit later. But what we're talking about is just the ability to twiddle your bat once or twice without getting too confused. Being able to do it without getting your bat stuck, and being able to do it and still keep in mind what side you've got. And the reason for that is just that at this simple basic level here, the ability if someone's pushing to, say, your forehand all the time, your inverted side, you want the ability to just turn the bat, push with the pips, and then turn the bat back to go back to your standard shot. That's very, very handy at the beginner level. If you can't do it, that's fine. You don't have to do it. It's perfectly possible to get away without it and wait till you're getting better. But just the ability to go push, 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 twiddle, push with the long pip, twiddle, and then come back and be ready to hit the next ball or push it. A simple tactic like that, just at a basic twiddle, hit it, twiddle it back, that would be very, very handy. And it's not that hard to learn. So I definitely recommend it if you can. And the last thing, not in terms of importance, but just the last thing I'll kind of mention in part of your game, is to have, if you can develop it, is one good serve. And by one good serve, I mean one good serve with the 3 variations, or at least 2 variations of backspin and side spin, float, pure side spin, and a little bit of top spin and side spin, and all look roughly similar. So you don't need this serve and that serve and that serve and that serve. You don't need 20 serves. It's okay to have them and use them, but you really need at this level one serve, whatever it is, backhand, forehand, one serve that basically you can go backspin, side spin, top spin, and they all look roughly the same. Okay? And the reason why we're recommending that is that firstly, at that beginning level, your opponent probably won't be able to tell the difference very well between serves. He won't pick it up very easily, so he'll make a lot of mistakes. Secondly, because you're adding side spin to your varying backspin or top spin, the addition of side spin will very much confuse your opponent and get him frustrated. And really, the other thing is, even if your opponent can read it, at that level, they're very, very poor. Beginners are very generally poor at handling combinations of backspin, side spin, or top spin, side spin. So it's worthwhile as a beginner yourself, rather than having 10 bad services or 10 mediocre serves, you're much better off developing one good serve relative to beginners. One very good serve that has backspin, top spin, and a couple of other variations that are just mediocre, but working mainly on that one serve, because that's going to immediately put your opponent under a lot of pressure. Okay, so in terms of importance, it's more important to have one very good variable serve than it is to have 5, roughly okay serves. Develop a very good serve, and if you can develop 2 very good serves, even better. And serving like that is really just a matter of, that's just practice. You don't need a partner for that. You just need a table, a bucket of balls, and the determination to serve a couple of hundred at a time. And you can develop that very fast. And there's no better way as a beginner to really beat a lot of other beginners than to have 1 or 2 very good serves that your opponent just can't handle. Because it won't be until you get to intermediate level that your opponent will be able to start to adjust to it very well. So you really have a weapon with the serve, a weapon that just wins you 3 points. So do that. So just to recap on these basic weapons that I'm talking about a strong push of both sides, just sound, one that you can do steadily without missing. also, probably on your backhand is usually easier, but the forehand or whatever is fine too. But the ability to vary the spin and put heavy spin on one side using it would also be very handy. Okay. But fundamentally we should be able to hit steadily with a push back and vary the spin from light to medium to heavier. You should be able to do that over and over. Okay, that's number one. We want, on the side that you mainly use your long pips or your anti-spin, the ability to just put the ball back on the table over and over again. Doesn't have to be low, doesn't have to be lots of variation, it just has to go over and hit the other side of the table. Okay, so you need to practice enough just to do that. We need a good attack with your inverted for one stroke, just one hit off easy balls. So it's not a set-up attack, it's just the ability, if the ball pops up high, you get the ball to pop up, you can hit it and generally put it away, or at least make your opponent struggle to deal with it. We need, or we would like, the ability to twiddle, and not to twiddle doing complicated things, but just the ability that if somebody's going to one side of your back, of your body all the time, the ability to twiddle it, play the other side, and twiddle straight back so that you don't get too confused. But it gives you some variation. That would be nice. Not a must-have, but very nice to have. And the last thing is we want is one good serve for that beginner level. That's very, very strong, that you can spin, backspin, side spin, top spin. So we want one of those. Now if you've got those things as a beginner, and it shouldn't be too much to develop, because rather than trying to spend your time as a beginner developing a big forehand loop, rather than trying to learn how to hit with the pimples, rather than trying to learn 20 serves, all this kind of stuff, you're really only got to learn about 4 or 5 things and practice away on those. Now, if you do that, how is this going to benefit you? Well, firstly, we're getting back to how can you use this to reduce your mistakes and increase your opponents. With those fundamentals, what you can do is basically, firstly, the pushing, having steady pushing, means that your opponent has to play more balls. And at the beginning level, especially on the forehand side, most opponents are a little bit weak there and can't push very well. So if you're able to push 10 balls in a row without missing most of the time, chances are your opponent is going to make a mistake before you do. So you're going to win any backspin rallies, you're going to win. So that's rule number one. You'll outlast your opponent in backspin rallies. The second thing is, by having long pips or anti-spin and just the ability to put the ball back with your long pips or anti-spin, what you're doing is you're getting automatically variation without any real work. Because if your opponent hits the ball from side to side, you go from inverted, long pip, inverted, long pip. So you're getting free spin variation without any work on your part. Okay? Again, that's going to make your opponent make more mistakes, because as a beginner, not only do they struggle to read normal rubber, they usually have no clue whatsoever about how to play against long pips or anti-spin. So your job is not to try and force mistakes with the long pips or anti-spin. Your job is simply to put the ball back and let them make mistakes off it. So give them the maximum chances to make mistakes. And that means, instead of you trying to do funny, amazing things with your long pips, put it back. And then they push it, put it back again. Put another one with the inverted, and use that natural variation to confuse your opponent and give them chances to make mistakes. Rather than you trying to be aggressive with your long pips and you making mistakes. Because at the moment, as a beginner, your technique isn't necessarily solid enough to be aggressive consistently. If it is that good, you're probably not a beginner, you're probably starting to get towards intermediate level anyway. So we're talking beginner level, where your hitting technique with long pips is probably, or anti-spin is probably not that great. So again, we're just trying to take advantage of your opponent's tendency to make mistakes, their inability to read spin, their inability to know what long pips or anti-spin does. We're taking advantage of all that. We're wanting also just to use simple spin variation. On your inverted side, you're using float, medium spin, heavy spin to add to the confusion. Okay? We're not using it to try and necessarily, doesn't have to be every ball, every ball completely different. Just go with your standard push. Every now and again, float one. Every now and again, a little bit heavier. You're not trying to, you're just letting your opponent make mistakes rather than always trying to change every ball and confuse yourself. And usually you won't need to. Having a solid put away, what you're doing is you're generally just trying to say, well, okay, we're pushing it around, and any time my opponent pops it up high because he misread the spin, I'll put it away. But I won't take a lot of chances trying to hit balls that are too low. I'm not sure of what spin's on it or anything like that. I'll just hit the balls that are easy to hit. And that will go a long way to cutting out your errors. Because at this level, a lot of the mistakes are made by people trying to start attacking against balls that aren't really suitable for them and that their technique isn't good enough. So what we're doing is we're cutting out your mistakes, sticking to attacking easy balls. And that will, again, it'll cut your mistakes and it'll also put a little bit more pressure on your opponent. Now obviously, if your attack is not good, if you can hit quite well, then great, you can hit more often. Then no problem with that. But what we're trying to focus on is if your hit is not all that great, then by just pushing it around and waiting for an easy one and hitting that, you'll play a higher percentage game and you'll have a better chance. We're minimising the amount of twiddling we need to do. We're not trying to do anything fancy or complicated to twiddle and hit and do a lot of stuff. None of that. We're only twiddling really if the opponent is always putting the ball to one side. We will twiddle to just use the other side for some variation. And then we'll twiddle right straight back. Because the chances are if the opponent's pushing, which is usually how they try and pin you down, they'll push to say the inverted because they know how the inverted plays. And they'll just keep pushing. And then what will be happening is essentially they'll be just going, okay, we're ready to, they're trying to push you and nail you down on that side. What they're then doing is you've got to change to the long pips. That ball will have little or no backspin. They'll play it as if it does. The ball will pop up, and provided you can twiddle back, you usually can just have a good chance of whacking the ball. So it's just a simple play. Another thing to minimise your mistakes is if your opponent has good long serves that you are struggling with and you're making mistakes with your inverted, use the long pips or use the anti-spin to just put the ball back on the table. The wonderful thing about long pips or anti-spin at that beginning level is that they virtually cut out the effect of the side spin. They're still affected a little bit by topspin or backspin, but really side spin no longer counts. So it doesn't matter how much side spin your opponent's putting on the ball, you can pretty much aim where you want with the long pips and the ball will go in that direction. So it means that you can aim for the centre of the table and the chances are pretty good. It may go up a bit or down a bit, but it will probably go towards the centre of the table with your long pips, with your anti-spin. And then your opponent now has to worry about this ball that's got all his spin coming back to him and that is possibly wobbling a bit, and he has to deal with his own spin. And a lot of cases beginners can't do that. So make use of your long pips. Don't be embarrassed. It's good tactics. It's not a silly idea. People sort of think, oh, you're using the long pips to cover up the fact that you can't return this serve. Well, yeah, that's the whole point. that's a tactically good idea. But if somebody's beating you with their long serves and making it difficult for you to get the ball back on the table, use the long pips or the anti-spin to get it back. Let them deal with the spin. That's just good table tennis, using the equipment that you have in the best way that you can. So what we're looking at, just to basically recap what I'm going on about here in beginning level table tennis, is because at the beginning level mistakes are the defining thing, and especially unforced errors are the defining part of beginner level table tennis. What I'm focusing on and giving you this sort of advice is we're trying to do two things. Firstly, we're trying to cut down the amounts of unforced errors that you make. So we're trying to cut down all the mistakes you make by trying to attack when your technique isn't up to it, or the ball is too low, too spinny, anything like that. Then what we're also trying to do, and in terms of unforced errors, we're also trying to cut out the errors that you make by twiddling too much, or by trying to sorry about that, my battery on the camera just cut out. Picking up from where I left off, what we're trying to cut down in terms of this stuff is we were trying to cut down your unforced errors. And I was just mentioning about the long pips. What you're trying to do at the beginner level, again, is what we're focusing on. Usually at the beginning level, long pip anti-spin players make too many mistakes by trying to do too much with the long pips and with the anti-spin. They're trying to do too much attacking, they're trying to do too much fancy twiddling, fancy patterns, trying to spin the ball with it too much, just pushing them further than what their technique can really handle. So in order to cut that down, we're just trying to say, look, stick to pushing with the long pips and occasionally twiddling to get the other side of the bat. And if you do that, what you're going to do is you're still going to get lots of variation from natural this side, that side, this side, that side. And your opponent's still going to struggle at that beginning level because he doesn't read spin very well. But what you won't be doing is you won't be making all those unforced errors by trying to attack balls that aren't there, by getting confused with your own twiddling. And that will maximise your chances. Okay. On the other side, what you're doing to your opponent is basically you're forcing your opponent to, he's not going to get any free points from you. So if the opponent plays a backspin game and pushes to you, you're going to be steady off both sides. You know, you're not going to give him any free points because you're just going to keep putting the ball back with you with a steady push. You're going to get lots of variation because you're going to be using the pips or the anti-spin on one side, and on the inverted side, you're going to occasionally float medium heavy, and you're going to change it a little bit. So there's lots of variation there going there. If you always place to one side, every now and again you'll twiddle it, play with the other side, twiddle back. So there'll be lots of variation going on. So you should be able to beat your opponent in backspin pushing. And all that leaves him then is the attacking game. He'll have to try and beat you by top spinning. And if he tries to beat you by top spinning, the trick for a beginner is he's somehow got to get started in a topspin rally to beat you. And that can be tricky for another beginner, because what he's generally going to do then is start to either topspin serves, and if he does use a lot of topspin serves, then all you need to do is really cover a lot more of the table with your long pips or your anti-spin, push the ball, and you're giving him backspin. And straight away he's back into a backspin rally. Or he has to try and hit his first shot off a backspin ball, which he's probably not so good about. If he doesn't like that, or he switches onto it and he starts to serve more backspin, well, you just cover a little bit more with your inverted side and give him a pushback, and you're still in backspin play. If he's good enough to push short, and make you push the ball back and then hit the first topspin. And if he can do that consistently to get started into a topspin rally, well, anybody who can do that consistently and lift the ball and then hit the next one topspin as well, he may not be a beginner. You may be talking about an intermediate player anyway. But if that's the case, well, that's fine. All you're going to do is basically up at the table, block the ball back with the inverted if he topspins it, and if he hits to your pip side, just put your bat there, let it hit, and it will turn back into backspin, and he has to lift again. So your opponent will struggle to get into topspin rallies because you'll be controlling that it's mainly a backspin pushing rally, and it'll only be topspin from your point of view when he pops it up and you can hit it. Now, as a beginner, let's say, what if you're more aggressive and you want to play more topspin rallies? Well, that's fine, you can do that. I mean, I'm not saying you have to beat someone by pushing. I'm just saying at the beginning level with a combination bat, it's a very good way to do it. But let's say you do want to play a little bit more topspin. Well, that's fine. What you then want to be doing is using the combination bat to set up more easy attacks for yourself. And that's going to be along the lines of possibly getting into that pushing start with backspin off your inverted, get your opponent to push the ball, and then push it with your long pips so that your opponent doesn't realise it's now light topspin. Get him to pop it up, and you should be able to start your attack even easier. Or you can still do the things a normal attacker would do. You can still serve a topspin serve, get him to return it, get straight away into top spinning, hitting with your inverted, and if he puts it to your other side, block the ball, you're back into a backspin rally, and then chop with the inverted side, wait for one, trick him with the long pips, get him to pop it up, and you're back in business. And that will work fine as well. There's nothing to say you can't do that. But what we're looking to do in really, you're trying to basically say, well, look, I want to cut down my mistakes. And at the beginning level, most of the mistakes made, especially by combination bat players, most of the mistakes are made by either trying to do too much with the anti-spinner with the long pips, or something that's in common with inverted normal players is being too aggressive, trying to do too much with the topspin and with the attack, more than your technique can handle. So all we're doing is basically playing, I'm recommending that you play a more conservative game that takes advantage of the characteristics of your long pips and anti-spin. You make the most of them. You make your opponent play them against them a lot, give him lots of chances to make mistakes. You be steady, and then when he gets sick of the backspin and if he wants to play topspin, you just use the long pips to block, turn the rally back into a backspin rally, and away you go again. You're back into backspin again. And you can play topspin rallies whenever you feel comfortable. Whenever the ball's there and it's easy and you're ready to hit it, you can go ahead and topspin it. And when it's not, you can push it. But as a beginning long pip or anti-spin player, what I would be saying is you should be basically, or I would recommend, focusing on basing your game on that controlled backspin pushing game and taking chances when they're there with the topspin putaways. If you want to be more aggressive, that's fine. Nothing to stop you doing that. If your forehand hit is better, is quite good, then there's nothing to say that you can't hit more often from more positions with your forehand, and only when they put it to your backhand do you have to go to the push. That's fine as well. But at this beginning level, try to cut out your mistakes by sticking to what you can do consistently. Try to make your opponent make more mistakes by giving him good spin variation, a couple of really good serves, and basically giving him lots of chances to make mistakes by going from inverted to the anti-spin, make him play a lot of balls, rather than trying to win points by doing too much with your long pips and anti-spin, and giving him free points. So if you can stick to that kind of thing, what you'll find is it won't be very long before you're beating all your fellow beginners, and you'll be starting to move up into intermediate status. Now, against intermediate players, things are going to be a little different, because the game is no longer characterised by unforced errors. It's got a different rhythm, and it's different. There's different problems and different solutions that you have to come up with. So, but basically, at the advanced level, at the beginner level, we're trying to cut down our mistakes. We're trying to maximise and encourage our opponent to make mistakes. And the best way to do that is to make intelligent use of our long pips and our anti-spin, and give our opponent plenty of chances to make mistakes against them and not give away free points. Okay, so that's about it for this little talk on beginning play, how to win at beginning level with long pips and anti-spin. Thanks.